Hello everyone, welcome to Baji Rao IAS Academy previous year questions analysis. So we have been analyzing and discussing the previous year questions. So how we can structure those answers and the way we can attempt those questions is very important. Now we have discussed all the question papers of the Jammu and Kashmir previous year questions. Now we will be discussing about UPSC 2022 mains questions. So we will start with General Studies paper 1. So the first question that was asked in UPSC 2022 mains, it is about the temple sculptures in medieval India. The temple sculpture represent social life of those days. Okay, so we have different temples in different parts of our country, so that were particularly constructed during medieval times. So those temples were constructed during medieval times. Now we can talk about the Bajirao temples. We can also talk about the Shore temple at Mamallapuram, Mahabalipuram. So there were a wide variety of temples that were constructed during the medieval times. And in fact, these temples also have a rich sculptural tradition. So in this context, we will try and understand how medieval Indian temple sculpture represent the social life of those days. So what does the social life exactly means? So social life means the status of a woman in the society and whether the caste system that was prevalent or not. So what were the social relations among the people, and what about the marriage? Okay, so all these factors we will try and understand. Now when you're writing this answer, so first you have to briefly introduce about the temple sculpture in medieval times. Temple sculpture in medieval times, you just briefly introduce this. And then since you have to write 150 words only, just write the demand of the question. So what is the essence of the question? You just write in the body part of the answer, and you just conclude with the importance, stressing on the significance of the Indian temple sculpture. Now in the introduction, you can introduce or you can write that medieval Indian temple sculpture is rich and diverse representation. Okay, so it has represented social life of medieval times, and it is part of rich cultural heritage of India. So it also represents rich cultural heritage during the medieval period. So therefore, in this context, the sculpture on these temples represent a wide variety of social beliefs, religious beliefs, political and social structure that was prevalent in the society. So what was the political and social structure that was prevalent in the society, and the cultural values of the people that were followed during the medieval times. Now we can divide the medieval Indian temple sculpture into 4 categories. So in the first category, we need to talk about East India and the temple sculpture in East India, and secondly Central India, West India, and also the Southern India. So if we talk about Eastern India, that comes Odisha, Bengal, and even Eastern Bihar, along with Assam and other northeastern states. So when we talk about East India, so the one famous medieval Indian temple is Puri Jagannath temple. It is located in Konark. So in this Puri Jagannath temple, we find a lot of sculpture. So in the very same temple, we also found that the Lord Jagannath, Balabhadra, Subhadra, and Chakra Sudarshan in Puri Jagannath temple. Okay, so these were sculpture that we can found in the temple, Puri Jagannath temple. So in fact, this temple also houses a life-sized carved figures of men and women in various sexual postures, and they were called as Mithuna. So these sculpture was called as Mithuna, and they were described in the Kama Sutra of Vatsayana. And this is the sculpture that was present in eastern India. So if we can describe this briefly. So after that we can also talk about central India. In central India we can have Khajuraho temple. So I hope that you all know about the Khajuraho temple. It is located in Madhya Pradesh. So that was particularly built by Chandelas during the medieval times. So in this temple there were other temples also called the Lakshmana temple. Okay, so this Lakshmana temple has depicted the battle scenes. It has sculptures that depict the battle scenes, and apart from battle scenes it also has hunting, elephants, horses, ceremonies, dances, erotica, as well as a daily life that was represented in sculptures of Lakshmana temple in Khajuraho. So if we look at this, ceremonies, dances and other animals, so they are part of normal day-to-day life of the people in those areas. So therefore Khajuraho temples are also rich representation of India's sculptural tradition and how it indicated the social life of the people who are living in that particular time. So after that, if we discuss about the West India, we need to specifically talk about Maharana Kumbh. Okay, so Maharana Kumbh, the rise of Maharana Kumbh, it led to the growth of temples and sculpture in the 15th century. Okay, so it has in fact reached its peak in the 15th century because of the rise of Maharana Kumbh in Western India. So if we talk about the West India, Jaipur is one of the famous for its marble images, and it can be best seen in Dilwara Jain temples. So Dilwara Jain temples are in Rajasthan, and it can be best found in Dilwara temples. So the theme in these temples revolve around Jainism and its basic teachings. So if we talk about South India, Cholas were very famous. Apart from Cholas, we also know about Pallavas, Chalukyas. So they were very famous rulers in South India. So the bronze sculpture of Nataraja of Cholas, that is very famous. In fact, UPSC has also asked a 10-mark question on this particular sculpture. So apart from that, we also know about the temple sculpture during the Chalukyan region. Okay, so it is sprinkled with the Hindu deities. So after that, we also know about the Ellora cave temples, Badami, and they have a lifelike sculpture and the deities, humans, trees and animals. A wide variety of representation can be found in Ellora, Badami and other lifelike structures, deities, animals, humans can also be found in these cave temples at Ellora and Badami. So if we mention an example, cave temples, particularly those at Badami. Okay, so the Badami cave temples also include a fine structures of Vishnu reclining on Sheshnag, Varaha, the boar, Narasimha, the half lion, and half man, Vamana, a dwarf. So therefore, the Eastern India, Central India, West India and South India have a rich temple sculptural tradition. And this rich temple sculptural tradition also represent the social life of the people who are living in that particular period of time. Now, what are the major depictions? How the sculpture has represented the social life of the people in that particular period of time. So first and foremost, we need to talk about the deities. So these sculptures have depicted deities on the walls of the temples. So these sculptures particularly represent Hindu gods and goddesses. Gods and goddesses. So therefore, it clearly reflects people religious and social significance. So people used to have a lot of religious belief, religious values and also the social values. Now religion is part of the society, the social aspects. So therefore the sculpture particularly represented or depicted various gods and goddesses. So the example is Lingaraja temple or Konaka temple in Odisha. They have showcased a sculptural deities or sculptures of deities. Apart from that, these temples also have scenes from everyday normal life. Okay, so we talk about the agricultural activities of the people in that period, so this was also depicted, and women engaged in the household chores, and people cooking, eating. So all these are normal day-to-day activities, and all these activities are represented in as part of sculptures. So the Mukteshwara temple in Bhubaneswar, Odisha, so this is also in eastern India, so which is adorned with the beautiful female sculpture. Apart from that, there are also a diverse representation. So diverse representation in the sense that all the factors of a life are represented as part of the sculpture. So it contains all walks of life. So the sculpture, the representation comes from all walks of life, whether it is nobleman and warriors, even the common people. So therefore, it has particularly showcased the social diversity of that particular period of time. Now, in fact, these sculptures also have a representation of the erotic sentiment. So erotic sentiment, the sculpture in those temples, particularly the Bajirao temples in central India, they have the erotic sentiment that was being represented in the sculpture. Okay, so Bajirao temples have this representation. So therefore, it represents or it showcases the importance of Shringara Rasa. It is a sentiment of erotic love, and that is given in the ancient Indian literature and even also part of the fine arts in India. Now, apart from that, the temple sculpture has also reflects the artistic style of people who are living in that period of time. So the evolution of artistic styles in temple architecture. So if you clearly identify different temples in a different periods of time, so you can clearly see the evolution of the artistic skills of the people over a period of time. In medieval times also, there are several temples and the sculptures which have been representing the artistic skills of the people in that period of time. So you can clearly see, or you can clearly observe through these sculptures, that there's a transition from classical simplicity to more ornate and decorative forms. So these sculptures were given more importance in terms of decoration and ornamentation. So therefore, you can clearly observe a clear transition of the sculptural tradition and even the artistic skills of the people in that period of time. So over a period of time, it reflects the taste and preferences of the people and the society at large. So this particularly can be observed a large relief structure in Mahabalipuram. It is in Tamil Nadu. So it is also known as Mamallapuram, and it is built by Pallavas. So after that, we can also observe the regional variations in this sculptural tradition. For example, there were distinct regional styles in temple sculptures. So what were those distinct regional temple sculptures? So you can observe this, they can found in the temples of Tanjavur, Gangaikonda Cholapuram, Tarasuram and Tribhuvanam. So in all these temples, you can observe different regional variations. So therefore, it also showcases diverse artistic traditions across the country. So since India has a huge geographical extent, so you can see or you can observe a diverse artistic traditions across the country. So while writing conclusion for this answer, you just simply conclude the importance of the sculptural tradition in Indian art. So medieval Indian temple sculpture, they provide a valuable resource for understanding the social life. So by observing these sculptures, we can understand the social life of the people who are living in those medieval times. And in fact, it also offers a rich tapestry of depictions that particularly encompasses deities, everyday activities, diverse representation, artistic styles, and regional variations. And this is how you have to summarize everything in the conclusion of this answer. So if you can observe here, so it is well summarized in this 2 lines. So this is how you can write the answer for this first question. So the next question that we are going to discuss is from history. It is modern Indian history. Now if you look at the way British were conquered India, so they have used a large number of Indian forces. So the question is, why did the armies of British Indian Company, they mostly comprising of Indian soldiers? It mostly comprises of Indian soldiers. So they won consistently against numerous and better equipped armies of the Indian rulers. So in fact, if you compare Indian rulers with the British conquerors or British East India Company, so Indian rulers have a numerous and better equipped armies than the East India Company. So what is the basic difference between the two? So make sure that this answer is not lengthy and try to write this answer in just 150 words. So that would be enough. Now in the introduction itself, you can write about what is being asked in the question. So the question is that why the East India Company consistently win against the princes or the local rulers. So Indians were recruited by the British East India Company. British East India Company had recruited Indians because there were certain advantages for them. So what were their advantages? Because Indian forces were much familiar with the local conditions. So they can be more familiar with the local conditions. So therefore it will help the British forces. Secondly, Indians were available at a lower wages compared to their European counterparts. So since they are available at a lower wages, and British would be able to employ more and more Indians into their armies. So because of this, the overall expenditure of British East India Company has been declined. So there's no need for excessive expenditure on armed forces because they are recruiting the cheaper Indian armed forces within India itself. In fact, these armed forces were not just used in India, but they were sent to the other parts of the world as well to fight the British war or fight wars on behalf of British. Okay, so in this context, the other factor that we have to consider is that if you look at the distance between UK and India, there's a huge distance. So because of huge distance, even people from UK were not preferring to come to India to serve in the armed forces. So because of that reason also, British have recruited more Indians into their army. However, recruiting more Indians into their army is not alone sufficient or not alone fulfills their obligation, their objective of conquering the entire India. Okay, so along with that, there are certain other factors that help them, the British, to conquer the Indian territory. So in fact, the English had enforced the every available means of war and administrative procedures in order to consolidate their authority over India. So what are the other factors that helped the British that Indian rulers were lacked? Firstly, British had a superior military and also the armaments strategy, and these strategies are very important. So you are having a military, so the military should be superior. It should be superior military and it should be backed by strong strategic thinking. So this strong strategic thinking is very important for success of any military. So therefore, in this context, the British had a cannon and assault rifles. So if you look at the weapon that British have, they were more advanced in terms of their range, their shooting capabilities and the shooting speed. So therefore, this is one such advantage for the British. Secondly, many Indian rulers, of course, they were also brought the European weapons. In fact, there was a rivalry between the East India Company and also the French forces within India. So therefore, the Indian rulers even purchased the European weapons from French. So if they are against the British East India Company. So therefore they were also brought the European weapons, but they lack the technical know-how. They lack the capability to use those weapons. And in fact, they were also failed to develop a war strategy that was developed by British, and this ultimately led to the failure of Indian forces in front of these British authorities. Okay, so the second factor that led to the success of British East India Company, they have a strong armed regulation, dedication, and consistent remuneration they are getting, because they were imposing taxes, the permanent settlement, Rayatwari, Mahalwari. Through this, they are getting taxes, and in fact, their home government has also been supporting the British forces at from home. So therefore, in this context, the British were very careful about a regular income and rigid code of conduct. So this rigid code of conduct ensured that the British commanders and soldiers are remaining loyal to the British East India Company. So this is another major advantage that helped British conquer Indian territories. So the rulers of India lacked the resources. This is obviously true, because they lack the unity and they also lack the necessary financial resources, and financial resources are very important for strong military. So since they lacked the necessary financial means or the financial resources, they were not able to pay the regular salaries for the soldiers. So paying salaries in cash is very important. So therefore Indian soldiers were not able to pay salaries in cash. And the other factors include some of the kings were dependent on their own bodyguards. So this has come down to a situation where kings even don't have their own armed forces. So they completely depend on their personal bodyguards himself, because there was always an attack by the mercenaries on the kings. Because of this reason, few kings were also dependent on the personal guards. Apart from that, we should also talk about the effective leadership. Now, if you look at the British leadership, British East India Company, you may have come across several names like Robert Clive, Warren Hastings, Elphinstone, Monroe. So they were able generals. So they were most efficient generals, and they have successfully implemented the strategies for the conquering of the Indian territory for the British purposes. So they have demonstrated exceptional leadership traits. So they have demonstrated the leadership traits that ultimately helped the British conquer India. So other factors include British also profited from the second line commanders. So those commanders include Sir Eyre Coote, Lord Lake, Arthur Wellesley. So if you look at the British war strategy, you can find several able leaders: Robert Clive, Warren Hastings, Elphinstone, and Monroe. So apart from that, there were also a second line commanders. So they are very important in a war. So therefore they also able to have a second line commanders. And these commanders are able to stand up for their nation's interest and honor. However, when you compare this with the Indian side also had excellent commanders. So we know about Hyder Ali, Tipu Sultan, Madhurao Sindhia, Madhavrao Sindhia, and also Jaswantrao Holkar. However, we lacked the second line of commanders that British possess. So this is another advantage that led to the success of British forces over the Indian rulers. Secondly, next, a solid financial foundation is also important. As we have already discussed, that Indian rulers lacked financial resources to pay the salaries for the employees. However, when you compare Indian rulers with the British forces, British rulers were backed by strong financial foundation, because they had a great deal of wealth, and that contributed to England by British trade. So since they have mastered the trade, and since they also have a monopoly over the Indian Ocean and several other territories, so they have mastered the British trade, and which led to the governmental assistance in the form of money, material, and other sources which are being provided for the East India Company, and that helped East India Company conquer India. Okay. Now, after that, there's also an absence of national pride and unification when we talk about Indian rulers. So there was an absence of cohesive political nationalism among the Indian rulers. So there's no unity. So there were always quarrels and mutual conflicts. So that has taken advantage by the British, and in fact the mutual differences between these rulers were skillfully exploited by the British forces to incite civil war among themselves, and that strategically benefited the British as well. So when you write the conclusion for this answer, the East India Company had a private army. So in all respects, the British Indian Army was more superior over the Indian Army. So in this context, the East India Company had a private army, and this East India Company has also utilized the armed power to impose terrible taxes in the sense that they have imposed Jamindari, Mahalwari, Rayatwari taxes, and taxes on a wide variety of activities. And apart from that, they have also used the army to carry out the officially approved plundering process. And in fact, they have also subjugated the Indian government using the army and other principalities. Okay, so therefore, it finally helped the British to they have used everything in a skilled manner to exploit the unskilled Indian workers, and the Indian armed forces were instrumental in this aspect. So after that, the next question that we are going to discuss is about famines that took place in India during the British rule. So these famines were one of the most serious famines that took place, where British did little to provide relief for the people who have affected by the famines. So by seeing these images, you can understand the scale of the famine. Okay, so throughout the British period, there were a number of famines. However, the British government had provided a little support for the people who have faced worst famines. Now the question is, why there was a sudden spurt in famines in colonial India since mid 18th century, and give the reasons for those famines. Now firstly, when you write the introduction, you can introduce in this way. So India was hit by recurrent means back-to-back famines from 1960s to 1947 AD. So in fact, as per the British sources, around 85 million Indians were died because of these famines. These famines led to the death of around 85 million people. However, in fact, in reality, these famines were also called as genocides that were done by the British against the people of India at that time. So because they have provided little or no support to the people who were worst affected by these famines. Now, here I have given a list of famines and the affected regions. So when you write the answer for mains examination, so it will be helpful to enrich your content when you mention these famines as examples. So in fact, there's a probability that these famines can also be asked in your prelims examination. So therefore, go through all the famines. So the first major famine that took place in India was Great Bengal famine, and that took place in the year 1770. So the areas which affected by this famine include Bihar, northern and central Bengal regions. So after that, we also have a Chalisa famine in 1982 to 1984, and here the regions which were impacted by the Chalisa famine, so they include Delhi, Western Oudh, Punjab, Rajputana and Kashmir. And there was also a Doji Bara famine or Skull famine 1788 and 94. So the regions include Hyderabad, Southern Maratha country, Deccan, Gujarat and Marwar. Agra famine 1837, so Central Doab, Trans Jamuna district, Northern Western provinces, and Upper Doab famine 1960-61, and Southern India famine 1876 and 78. So this famine is one of the most serious famine that attracted little help from the British. In fact, that led to a widespread mortality of the people because of the hunger. The Southern Indian famine of 1876-78. So Indian famine 1896-97, Indian famine 1899-1900, and the Bengal famine 1943, that was happened in Bengal region. So these were the famines that India has gone through that led to the death of around 85 million people. So if you come to the key demand of the question, so what were the reasons for such recurring famines in the colonial era? So what were the reasons? So first and foremost, we need to talk about the colonial policies. We know that colonial policies were exploitative in nature. So they used to exploit people, and in fact the colonial policies tend to benefit the colonial interests rather than the Indian interests or the Indian people. So they have adopted a set of policies like rack renting. So what is a rack renting? So it is extortion of higher rents on land. So the policies include rack renting, higher levies on war, free trade policies that benefited the foreign trade of the foreign countries, and expansion of export agriculture that led to the minimal food grains in India, and that further fueled famine, and neglect of agriculture investment. There was a very less agricultural investment that has also further fueled famines in India. So apart from that, we should also talk about the commercialization of agriculture. So what does the commercialization of agriculture? Now agriculture was practiced for the commercial purposes, not for the substitution or for the ensuring food security. So the food crops are being replaced with the commercial crops like jute and rubber. And this is also another reason for famines in India. So India used to export, the British East India Company in India used to export opium, indigo, jute and cotton. So they constitute a key components of the economy of the British Empire. So in fact they used to generate a vital amount of revenues from the export of these agricultural products. So because of this reason, they have neglected the food requirements of the people, the food security requirements of the people in those regions, because the cultivation of commercial crops has been significantly benefiting the British Empire. So after that, the colonial export policy has also significantly neglected Indian interests or the domestic industrial interests. In fact, they have started exporting rice and wheat to the other parts of the world. So one example is two of the worst famine affected areas. They are Madras Presidency. In Madras Presidency, two of the most famine affected areas are Visakhapatnam and also Ganjam district. So despite they have been facing worst famine of their times, British continued to export food grains from India to other countries. So after that, the apathetic British response to the famines is also another major reason for the famines. For example, there were the codes, the famine codes that were being implemented by the British during the famine times. So what does this famine code means. So the famine code defines the response of the British government to these famines. In fact, under these famines, the officers were used to provide food to the victims of the famine, but the food is only sufficient for the people that they will never die, but they will continue to suffer with problems like hunger, malnutrition, and other health related issues. So they'll never provide a food that is sufficient for the individuals. So therefore we can consider the policy, the famine code of the British is apathetic. So after that, there were two world wars that took place in the year 1914 as well as 1939. So during these two world wars also, British used to divert the food grains from India to other parts of the world. So that in fact led to the Bengal famine. So this is one of the most serious or the worst famine that India had ever experienced in the year 1943. So diversion of food grains during the Second World War is led to the Bengal famine 1943. So after that, we could also talk about the agrarian policies that were followed by the British. So these agrarian policies were not benefited the peasants. In fact, the agrarian policies led to the forceful extortion of land revenue from the peasants and also forced the farmers to cultivate the commercial crops like opium, jute, and also indigo. In fact, the land revenue policies like Jamindari, Mahalwari and Rayatwari systems further pushed back agriculture production and led to the agricultural backwardness of the country. And in fact, all these factors have led to the serious famine in India during the past, during the rule of British. However, the famine conditions were further aggravated by the other factors like declining or stagnant agricultural production and rising population, increasing unemployment, and the apathy that was shown by the British during the famines. Because of this reason, the famine-like conditions were further worsening, and that led to the huge toll of a large number of people during these times. Okay, so in this manner you can conclude the answer. So the next question that we are going to discuss is about primary rocks. This question is about primary rocks. Now, what were the primary rocks? So this was also asked by the UPSC in 2022, and in this answer we need to describe the characteristics and types of primary rocks. Now, primary rocks were also known as igneous rocks. Okay, so what were the rocks types? Igneous rocks, sedimentary rocks, and also metamorphic rocks. So these are the different rock types. However, the first stage of the formation of rocks is known as igneous rocks, or they were also called as the primary rocks. Now, the primary rocks or the igneous rocks formed under the conditions like extreme heat and also pressure. So under these conditions, the primary rocks usually form. So what are the different types of primary rocks? So they include the basalt rocks and the granite rock, pegmatite, volcanic breccia. So these are the different types of the rocks. They are also known as primary rocks. Now, the primary rocks or the igneous rocks, they generally originate from the molten magma solidification. Molten magma solidification. So I hope you know what exactly is magma. So magma is whenever there was a volcanic eruption, then the magma released from the magma chambers. So for example, this is a volcanic eruption took place, and this is a magma chamber, and from the magma chamber, magma being released. So if it comes out, it is called as lava. However, inside these chambers, it is known as magma. Okay, so it originates from the molten magma's solidification. The solidification of this magma inside these chambers led to the formation of primary rocks. Okay, so it led to the formation of primary rocks, and these primary rocks actually form the crux of the Earth's crust. So they form the crux of Earth's crust. So because of the unique characteristics, so that mirror their formation process and mineral composition. So because of their mineral composition, their formation process, it is resulted in a unique characteristics, or these rocks can get a unique characteristics. Now firstly we need to discuss about the characteristics and also the types of these primary rocks. When we talk about the formation part of these rocks, when we discuss about the formation, primary rocks usually crystallize when magma solidifies. So we have discussed, we have understood what is magma. Now magma comes from the magma chambers. When magma solidifies, then that led to the formation of primary rocks. And in case of it occurs inside the crust or inside the mantle, it is considered as intrusive, or it is if it happens subterraneanly, it is known as intrusive, or if it is above ground, it is known as extrusive form of primary rock. Now the examples of these rocks include the granite and basalt. So granite is an intrusive form of a rock and basalt is an extrusive form of a primary rock. So when we talk about the texture of these rocks, the cooling pace and mineral presence dictate the primary rock's texture. Okay, so the way or the time that has been taken for the cooling of these rocks and mineral presence also dictates the primary rocks. For example, the coarse grained or primary rocks, they slow at a very slow pace. Cooling takes place at a very slow pace. Okay, so if crystals are larger, the cooling takes place at a very slow pace. Example can be mentioned, that is granite. And in case of a fine grained, so it happens that they cool very quickly because they have a smaller crystals. The example is basalt rock. Now after that, when we talk about the mineral composition of the primary rocks, so these primary rocks have a lot of minerals. So the mineral varieties include feldspar, quartz, mica, and even olivine constitute. So these are the different minerals that we can found in the primary rocks. Okay, so primary rocks in fact constitute these minerals, and the constitution of these minerals impact the cooling capacity and the density of these primary rocks as well. So here an example is being given: mineral dense gabbro, a dark hefty igneous rock can be mentioned as an example. And so volcanic and plutonic types of rocks, so this is also another type of rocks. So few primary rocks are volcanic in nature and the other rocks are plutonic in nature. So it solely depends on the location of the formation of these primary rocks. Okay, so that separates primary rocks into volcanic rocks and plutonic rocks. So volcanic rocks are generally extrusive, they form on the ground. So plutonic rocks are subterranean. Okay, they are subterranean rocks, so they form under the ground. So in this context, volcanic rocks are generally a surface forming, so they form on the surface. They are also fine grained rocks. Example is andesite. So andesite can be mentioned as an example for the volcanic rocks. So after that, when we talk about the plutonic rocks, so these plutonic rocks are subterranean in nature. So if you view this as a ground or the surface, the plutonic rocks usually form in this region. Okay, and they are very slow cooling, coarse grained rocks, and example is diorite. So in this context, when you write the conclusion, you can mention the significance of these primary rocks. So comprehending the primary rocks or knowing about the details or the mineral composition about these primary rocks will help understand the characteristics. Okay, so will help understand Earth's geological past and in fact the ongoing transformation, and this is very important to understand the overall evolution of Earth, and in fact it also offers significant insights into the formation of Earth and other planets. Okay, so further research and exploration will unravel their genesis, composition, and diverse industrial relevance of these primary rocks. Now, the minerals which these primary rocks constitute are very significant for the industrial processes. So therefore, minerals are scanty in nature. Having a comprehensive research on these primary rocks will further help us understand the properties of these minerals. So therefore, they have a huge industrial applications. And that's all for today. And tomorrow also we will understand the structuring of the few more UPSC previous year questions. So okay, thank you.